Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I guess we can kick off, if that's okay. Just so you all know, we have two remote participants, and I'm not sure how they're going to be sort of like projected on the screen. I imagine as they speak. Okay, Grace. Grace will be our first speaker after I do a quick introduction. So, hi, Grace. Great to see you. Welcome, everyone, to the final talk of the day in this room, and I guess final sort of slide of the Tuesday program. Perfect. Thank you. Where we're going to talk about sort of technology and power in times of crisis. And of course, we've just experienced a pretty significant crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to, I think, primarily look at sort of cases and examples from the coronavirus pandemic in different parts of the world. But I hope also, because I know everyone's pretty much exhausted from 2 years of lockdown and talk about COVID, but also think more broadly around sort of future crises and how the lessons from the past couple of years translate to future crises around the world. So my name is Aaron Martin. I am an assistant professor at the European Center on Privacy and Cybersecurity at the University of Maastricht. I'm also wearing a second hat today because I'm here filling in for Professor Lynette Taylor from the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society, who is the lead of an ERC project on global data justice. We have 4 presenters, 2 of whom are in the room with me and 2 of whom are online, as I mentioned. If we could put my slides on, it would help me with the introductions. Thank you. Our first presenter is Grace. She is, I think you're now at Open Society Foundations, Grace, correct me if I'm wrong, but for a long time worked at CIPIT at the Strathmore University in Kenya. And I imagine she'll present sort of the Kenyan perspective on digital technology during the pandemic. Lots of interesting lessons from Kenya. Our second presenter is here in the room, Mariana Rielli from Data Privacy Brazil, which is a civil society organization focused on privacy rights in Brazil. Our third presenter is Frederic, who I think until very recently worked at the European AI Fund, and I'm not sure where it's based, but she's based in Berlin. She's now with Human Rights Watch. She's also recently published a great book called Fake AI, which looks at various questions around sort of fish oil, snake oil AI, the pseudoscience around AI, and some of the sort of policy and regulatory implications from a market of solutions that perhaps don't do what they're said to do. And she's a great person to have in the room because she's also been involved in an array of projects that the European AI Fund sponsored, looking at sort of COVID and tech over the past couple of years. Sorry, back to my slides. Thank you very much. Ian Brown, who wears many hats. I'm putting his FGV hat on today. World-renowned expert on privacy and cybersecurity. And I have to say, sorry to embarrass you, Ian, recently recognized as a rule breaker by Politico. So great to have him here to reflect on, I imagine, the UK experience around COVID apps, but there's a lot to say around also the role that interoperability could play in challenging some of these power dynamics that are increasingly prevalent in our societies. And then, of course, I'm the moderator for today. I won't say much up front. I will very quickly plug a report that we published that was sponsored by the European AI Fund. But my job mostly is just to kind of keep time and put questions to the speakers as appropriate. So about that report, just very briefly, I think last week, maybe a couple of weeks ago now, we published a report based on about a year of research, essentially looking at how European countries have experienced sort of technology, and in particular how the tech sector has been sort of integral to the pandemic response in different European countries. This was, as I mentioned, sponsored by the European AI Fund and based at the Global Data Justice Project at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology, and Society. And I have to say, it's not our normal business to kind of look at EU issues at the project. We have a sort of global focus and have primarily looked at some issues, for example, in the humanitarian space, which is where I do most of my work, but also in Kenya, Singapore, and in Latin America and India. But we saw this opportunity to perhaps take some of the lessons from the research that we had been doing under the ERC grants during the pandemic in particular to understand what was happening with respect to tech and the tech industry in response to the crisis over the past year. So we published this report. It's a significant report. I won't give you a full-blown summary now, but just a couple points from the executive summary and some of the recommendations. What we're grappling with is this sort of rapid expansion of commercial technological power during the pandemic in a context where the regulatory frameworks for data protection and privacy and even sort of competition don't really address the core issue, which is the opportunism and the lack of oversight with respect to tech investments and tech adoption, primarily by the public sector during the pandemic. We built on a really great paper by Tamar Sharon, great to see Tamar in the room today, where she's focused primarily on COVID apps, and in particular the Apple and Google solution to kind of explore beyond sort of questions of privacy and data protection, what this means for politics and power, questions of ethics and expertise. She's a philosopher, and it was a nice sort of alternative perspective on some of the underlying issues that we saw kind of unfolding during the pandemic. We look at a range of sectors in the report: health, education, security, transportation, payments, and identity. And among other issues, we kind of highlight some of the challenges for public sector accountability and the provision of public goods during the past year or so. We look at what civil society organizations in Europe have been doing in terms of naming, blaming, and claiming vis-a-vis some of these transgressions, and we provide some recommendations, which are here. Just very quickly, I know we're at a privacy and data protection conference, but as Tamar points out in her paper, and as we try to reiterate in the report, that often privacy and the sort of privacy discourse gets co-opted by industry, and sort of solutions that are problematic for other reasons are somehow branded as privacy enhancing or privacy protective, and we need to sort of understand where that breaks down and how that's used rhetorically for other reasons. We also, insist. Okay, the report takes a sector focus, looking at different sectors and what's happening with industry and in the sort of development of solutions, but we have to try to connect some of these sectors and understand some of the underlying fundamental issues that are at play. And I think something actually that we learned from Kenya pre-pandemic, but which I think is especially relevant here, is you need to connect organizations that are working on digital rights issues with what we call sort of sector-based organizations. So in Kenya, there was some strategic litigation against the national identity system, which was motivated, among other reasons, by some claims made by the Nubians, which didn't have digital rights in mind. They were more interested in sort of questions of exclusion and so forth. But you saw this sort of coming together of different groups, different civil society groups in particular, with different kinds of expertise, which made for an even stronger case vis-a-vis the ID system there. The report is meant, the recommendations of the report are meant for civil society, and we think it's important that they look for sources of funding that kind of facilitate this collaboration across different kinds of organizations. And of course, this isn't just a European problem. There's an opportunity to coordinate transnationally to map some of these challenges going forward. So that's just a quick plug for the report. I'll stop now. Thank you very much. Grace, I'm going to hand it over to you to present on the Kenyan experience so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm so jealous and envious of you guys who are physically together while the rest of us are still sticking it out on screens. But all my love to you guys, and I've wanted to join you. But back to the problem. Maybe one way to look at what happened in Kenya and a lot of African countries during the pandemic and as a response to the pandemic is to frame it as a moment. And in many African countries, there have been moments of constitutional change that have led to a lot of changes in society. There have been moments of, public health emergencies like, Ebola, malaria, HIV/AIDS, and there have also been, natural disasters. And I think one more recent one was a cyclone in the southern part of Africa. And, these moments are normally treated as a sectoral emergency in whatever sector they appear in, like a constitutional change would be a constitutional moment and so on. But for this COVID pandemic, it turns out that it was not so much a public health emergency as it was a technology, a space for technology to manifest itself, which was really interesting because, like, for example, in Kenya, we noted that, well, there was maybe a task force formed by the health ministry to look at the health issues. There was also a task force formed by the ICT ministry to look at how we can use ICT to respond to the pandemic. And so even in the report, we try to look at this as the pandemic phase of Kenya's ICT development. There have been other phases of ICT development, but the pandemic just brought on a whole other phase. And some of the interesting trends we noted, which is also common to many other African countries, including Uganda, which a colleague of mine was looking at, was this use of emergency measures, which normally happens during moments such as constitutional moments and public health, to bring in long-lasting technological change. So, for example, there was all this surveillance by mobile network operators. There was also health surveillance using ICT tools. But this happened without going through the scrutiny or the debate that such a big change would normally go through. So it didn't go through parliament. It was just an executive decision that was gazetted and announced as, the COVID figures were being announced. There was no, in other countries like South Africa, the civil society there really fought for what they call sunset clauses, where they were saying, we understand that this is an emergency and that there are some measures that have to be taken, but can we agree that after a while we shall look at these measures and then retire them if they no longer serve the community or the collective, the nation. But in Kenya, we did not have that debate until much, much later, when some of these things had been normalized, some of the technology had been tested, some of it successfully, some of it failed. But for sure, you can say that we have been propelled to another phase of our lives, and we shall not be. It shall be very difficult to, go back to pre-pandemic, which is not the problem, because change happens in life, and that is expected. I think the problem comes in that it is the technology that is coming over and above everything else, over and above the law, over and above regulation. And another point I'd like to make in this introduction is to point out how real and how much you can see the layers of actors in this change. In many other moments before, the main actors would have been perhaps the government and the development sector. But in this moment, the technology, the owners, so to speak, of the technology are actually technology companies. And what is observable is that they've actually, there are so many instances when there's repurposing of technology to respond to the pandemic, but in the process also to make money, make profit, amass data that is going to be useful for future business ventures or ongoing business ventures. And this is from, what would look mundane or what would look very normal, like, maybe work from home or mobile money. Because what happened is that now, as part of the pandemic measures, people had to work from home, or there was encouragement of mobile money to avoid contact with each other. But this now will turn out to be big business opportunities, and also the data gathered from this moment propels the companies to something else. So, for example, it will not be surprising, and in fact, we can observe that mobile money mobile network operators are now becoming platforms that are providing much, much more than just mobile money. From the home internet, we are quickly moving to Internet of Things, and so on. There are so many other examples. We are quickly moving to mobile health, and so on. So, and this is what the point of the report, that we can see transition from one sector to another mediated by technology. I don't know whether I should stop at this and
Grace, I think it's a good opportunity to stop. We will
okay.
hand over to Mariana for her presentation, but we're going to bring you back in for some discussion later, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. Like Aaron said, I'm from Data Privacy Brazil, which is an organization that focuses on data protection, but we are increasingly more concerned with understanding data protection through a lenses of social justice and not just individual rights. So this is very important for us, and this opportunity to discuss the report and the findings, and also to present some of our work is very important. So basically what I'm going to speak about and present is a project that we conducted at Data Privacy Brazil. The research was carried out during 2020 and 2021, and it the time span that it covers is 2020 in Brazil, and it is our objective was to map out and to try to understand the effects of the pandemic on the adoption of data-driven technologies by the Brazilian government at all levels, so at the federal level, state level, and the municipal level. And if you can please pull up the website, I'm just going to show, I think I noticed that the translation is missing a part, so it's an investigation about technologies based on personal data, and it should say something about fighting COVID. But basically this is viral data, which is the final product of the research, in which we mapped out the technologies that were the solutions that were adopted and that were promoted even by media and official media vehicles, that governments at all levels were adopting these technologies to fight COVID. And I want to say first that something that caught my attention in the report that you just launched was this discussion that we should go beyond privacy and data protection, and this was something that we discussed a lot, even prior to actually beginning the research, because what we really wanted to look at was the relationships between the actors, the public agencies and the companies, and the details of these arrangements. This is what we really wanted to look at, and we were unable to do that at that point for several reasons, and lack of transparency was one of them. So when we did a deeper analysis, which is in a second report. We focused on compliance with existing regulation and privacy and data protection rights, but it's still a very open question, like of the details of these arrangements that we encountered, and I will speak a little about the lack of transparency thing, but basically, in terms of numbers, very quickly, we looked at 253 initiatives spread over 24 out of 27 states in Brazil, and also 77 municipalities, cities with over 100,000 inhabitants, and also 22 solutions that had a national reach. And the idea was that these solutions, they had to be first employed by the state, regardless of who was the developer or the supplier of the technology. These were solutions that the state was employing to basically fight COVID, and I will speak a little about that. They had to use personal data, they had to process personal data, and there was some discussion about anonymization, like a lot during the project, but I won't be able to comment much about that, but basically you had to process personal data. And the third requirement, of course, is that these solutions had to be promoted as a way to fight COVID, and that led to a pretty wide list of functionalities. So basically from contact tracing to monitoring of the use of face masks and monitoring of social isolation rates, like in a few, I think it was 9 months, so that we looked at. Basically a lot of different functionalities, and also, for example, telemedicine and applications that people use to access health services, they all kind of fit into this criteria. So basically a lot of different functionalities. And of course, the largest number of solutions were focused on the monitoring of the levels of social isolation, so heat maps at first, and these came from two sources. There was geolocation data, which was provided by a single company. A single Brazilian company accounts for almost 20% of all suppliers of technology that were used by Brazilian governments during the pandemic. And the other one was data from telecom companies. And the second most common functionality was the one that I mentioned, which was provision of telemedicine services. And like I said, since I started talking about suppliers, we found that of those that were identified, because like I said, there was a huge problem with transparency, but of the ones that were identified, about 60% were private companies, and the rest were either public agencies, public universities, and other types of organizations that were supplying these technologies. And like I said, also a single company, which at the time was called In Loco, and now it's Incognia. It's a Brazilian company that also has offices in the US, accounted for almost 20% of that total of suppliers of technology. And it's interesting because this is a company that is specialized, like their main product is location identity technology. So basically they use geolocation data and network data and other device intelligence data to identify users, and which is based on their unique behavior patterns. This is how they present themselves. And this is mainly used to detect fraud. Basically, this is the main use that the technology has. And then when the pandemic started, they basically provided that service to local governments, both state and at the municipal level as well, so that they could identify whether people were leaving their houses, and also understand how the social isolation measures were being enforced and what should be done from that. So, and the other one, like I mentioned, the other way that the government acquired this data was through telecom companies. And so basically, what I want to say is that like the biggest suppliers and the biggest share of the suppliers that we identified fall into that category of a domain where they did not already have history, but where they have the infrastructure to provide for the government very quickly and almost in all cases at no cost. So these were free either donations or free licensing agreements where the governments did not have to pay for that. So, like I said at the beginning, I'm going to conclude in a few minutes, but like I said at the beginning, we weren't able to look, to be able to understand whether transgressions had occurred. We actually, at the time, we did not have even the tools to identify if actual sector transgressions had occurred. But I think this information, for example, about the no-cost exchange of technology is very relevant because I think I have the number here, but from the contracts that we were able to identify, which were like less than half of the total, I think 60% of those were either donations or free licensing agreements. And also when we had some interviews with the companies, even with Incognia, they relate the fact that governments were actively seeking their help and wanted to use the technology to show that they were doing something, because this is important. Context is very important here too. There was a political struggle in Brazil between the federal level and the federal government and also states in terms of what was being done to fight COVID, because people were, we had some of the highest levels of mortality, of deaths, and some of the worst dealing with the pandemic in general. So this political aspect was very important, and the use of technology to show that things were being done to fight COVID was also very relevant. And so the last thing that I want to say, and I think I mentioned it a few times, is that this research took place over almost a year. We submitted 800, actually was 799 FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, to governments to be able to access the contracts and more information, because these adoptions of solutions were being published in the media, but we didn't have access to any details like of the actual arrangements. And these were all public uses of these technologies, so there should be publicity. And after 800 FOIA requests and also like a lot of different ways to search for information, transparency portals, official gazettes, we were able to find less than half of these contracts. And and even though there was an exceptional circumstance in Brazil, there were some relaxation of public procurement rules, but that was not one of them. There should be publicity even when there was no cost, even if it was a donation. So this was something that is a problem, because we understand that transparency is, when we're talking about transparency and surveillance, there's a lot of discussion of whether citizens would be able to use this information, particularly in a situation of a crisis. But for us, for civil society, to be able to understand what was going on, it was very hard, because we couldn't answer some of the questions that we were after, because we did not have access to basically any information. So yes, I think I used my time, and there's more, but we can discuss it later.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That was fascinating. I do have some questions which I'll save for later. Frederic, over to you.
I just realized I was meaning to close the door in the background. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the previous speakers. Yes, so I'm speaking with two separate hats. So when we initially thought about this panel, I was the director of the European AI Fund, and we were very fortunate to be able to support the work done by Aaron and Lynette Taylor, amongst many others, in a funding stream called Tech and COVID. The separate hat I'm wearing is I'm now the director of the newly founded technology division at Human Rights Watch. So what I'm going to do in my intervention, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to start with a meta comment. I'll talk a bit about the rationale behind why at the time we thought it was very important to fund this kind of work. And we'll also share some of the finding that other organizations we worked with in Europe found in their research. And then finally, I'll do a little bit of teaser about some upcoming work we're doing at Human Rights Watch that is relevant to the theme of this panel. So to begin with a meta comment, since I've been thinking about this, I've been finding working on the broader implications of COVID uniquely challenging / exhausting. And I think there are two reasons for this, and I want to bring them to our collective attention because I really think they do matter. The first one is there is a constantly changing reality. The virus itself is mutating. As we've seen over the past few years, it comes in different waves, and each of these have a different temporality in different places depending where you are. The second one is there's a constantly changing perception of reality. At the beginning, for a very brief time, there was a shared sense of emergency, but very quickly this turned into huge regional differences. So during the pandemic, I moved from the UK to Germany. And even now, if you're traveling, I recently traveled to Scandinavia and Switzerland, it is a completely different reality than it is in Germany, where I currently am. I said this in 2020, I would still say this now. I don't think we're quite ready yet to really wrestle with the implication of what all of this means, because we're still in it and it's not quite yet over. But that doesn't mean that it's not important to talk about it and study it, but I always tell this myself as a reminder. So putting myself back into the fall of 2020, the reason why at the time at the European AI Fund, we thought it was really important to support this kind of work was two things. So first of all, many of the ethical human rights challenges that we identified in AI were also potential risks of the global tech response to COVID-19. So many of the issues that we talk about in other contexts, exclusion, discrimination, mass surveillance. The second one was also, there was a strong sense that the diffusion of technology and norms that arise from our collective response will have implications for generations to come, potentially. So we set out to fund this work for two reasons. I think, first of all, we really wanted to make sure that all the organizations that had been monitoring Europe's tech response since the start of the pandemic are also able to continue their important work. This was mostly done as rapid response work on top of additional work. So I think it's really important that different organizations were able to monitor what was happening in real time. The second one is, and again, this may have changed, and I think it has changed, but we had a very strong sense for at least a year that there were several discourses, discussions in different countries within Europe that really weren't connected. I think also because the realities were so different. So in funding this area, we set out a couple of key thematic areas that we thought were important to monitor. So one is reviewing lessons learned from the contact tracing debate in Europe, identifying lessons learned about data sharing agreements in an emergency, understanding power shifts caused by the tech response to the pandemic in Europe, preparing for debates about immunity certificates and digital IDs, and mapping the use of tech for vaccine development. I don't think we ended up doing this. So here are some of the key observations that came from this work. I think my first one is I do not have a clear picture about what happened to the diffusion of norms in technology. And I would very much say that this work is still ongoing and not completed. The second observation, which is also my own, is that there is still a lot of accountability work that still needs to be done. We've seen in the UK, only now the trials have completed about lockdown parties that happened, but there are a lot of procurement decisions that were made, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, where that haven't really fully been worked through, I would say. So I'm going to share two thematic areas of findings. So one was the theme sort of AI and identity. And the organizations that worked on this was the Ada Lovelace Institute, but also Algorithm Watch. And there are sort of key themes that emerge from this discussion. I think one is, and I think this is really fascinating, we haven't seen a quantum leap of more AI, algorithmic systems as a result of the pandemic, but rather something along the lines of infrastructure build-up over time. So during the pandemic in Europe, digital infrastructure was established that could, over time, prepare the ground for greater rollout of digital technologies such as identity. But we have not seen a quantum leap in the use of AI. This is also something I talk about in the Fake AI book. And I think this has been done by Nesta, a study looking at AI applications throughout the pandemic. It's quite disappointing, or it really has been revealed that the technology has not been useful in tackling the pandemic. The second key finding was the buildup has not happened equally across Europe, and it is more prominent in some areas than others. I think this is really important. So you've seen infrastructure build up in healthcare, in education, in public sector services, but again, this has not happened equally in different parts of Europe. And then the third finding in this area was that we were witnessing the beginning of the institutionalization of app-based health services. So this is this one theme, identity and AI. The second cluster, and this is where the Global Data Justice Project fits in, was around infrastructure and power. One, and this has emerged from the debate about contact tracing app, it is very hard for governments to evade big tech, and a lot of it depends on it. That's a key finding of pandemic tech in Europe. But the second one is there's also a lot of small technology or lesser known tech companies that can be hugely disruptive. So in the context of Germany, there was an app called the Luca app, which was hugely controversial because it lacked some privacy protections, and that was an unknown, completely new emerging app that didn't exist before. Another key lesson is there is a systemic lack of expertise in the public sector and in governments. This is what was remarked especially by Superlab, who did a mapping of several civil society initiatives that have happened. And the third one is there is a need for more public knowledge and expertise on tech to hold governments accountable to the decisions that are being made in an emergency. So these are some of the themes that emerged as part of this research. And I want to conclude with just a teaser of some of the upcoming research that my colleagues are doing that may be relevant to this theme. I have a colleague in the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch who is about to publish, it's not public yet, an incredibly comprehensive analysis of education technology that governments recommended during the pandemic. And I don't want to spoil the findings, but as you can imagine, we did find some very gravely concerning practices. I'm very excited for this research to come out because I think education is one of the key areas where we saw a very quick and rapid roll-up of infrastructure that is likely here to stay. And the second one is my colleague Amos Toe is working on labor conditions in the gig economy. It's not a core pandemic tech topic, but it's an area or an industry that has been hugely shaped by the pandemic and its wave and the different demands that it has caused. So those are the two upcoming research reports that I wanted to teaser. And I'll end here, but I'm very happy to answer more questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Frederique. Great summary of the work that you supported while at the European AI Fund. I have some questions about where things are going at Human Rights Watch, but we'll park those for now. Ian, over to you for our final presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Lovely to be here after 2.5 years without physical meetings. I read the report on the way over yesterday day before from London. Thought it was really interesting Great work and raises a lot of really interesting questions. What I'm going to do is pick up some issues that the report looks at and talk a little bit about what I think we can say about them from the case of England's contact tracing app. I think there are several other people in the room that have done quite a bit of work on this as well, so it would be great for them to come in the conversation following this. Very briefly, the UK, like several other European countries, including France and Germany, I believe, began early in the pandemic looking at commissioning and developing centralized tracing apps, so information from large numbers of citizens of those countries using apps on their phone would have been held centrally by governments and used for various contact tracing of people after notification of a positive case. As I'm sure you're all well aware, Apple and Google then, just a month or two after some of these plans were made public, developed their exposure notification API, which had a more decentralized model where location information was kept more on people's phones. And the UK government, under sort of quite strong political pressure over time, moved from this centralized model that they had been recommended by epidemiologists. They were being advised by at Oxford University for various reasons to making use of the Google and Apple model. So I'll just say a little bit, I think, about what that case can tell us so far about democratic accountability, about the moving beyond a privacy and bias legal focus that the report talks about. I think the report says some really interesting things about dependencies that the governments now have on infrastructural tech, and linking that to some other work I've done recently, as Aaron mentioned, on competition reform, particularly interoperability and smarter procurement by government. And then just a very brief point at the end, I think, about one way to look at this might be the constitutionalization of private sector tech infrastructure. So briefly, the UK government, as self-harming as Brexit has been in terms of its cooperation with the rest of the European Union's member states, is a reasonable-sized, reasonably resourced government by any global standards. It was in quite a good position to design, develop, commission this contact tracing app. It had explicit units within the government's health department, the Department for Health and Social Care in the UK had already set up a unit which was called NHS-X, which was about making use of new technologies in the public health system, and it was that unit which took the lead on commissioning this contact tracing app. So democratic control, good. I don't think anyone, the worst critics of that would say that this was something imposed on at the start, the centralized model imposed on the UK government. But of course, as we've heard from, I think, all of the previous speakers, particularly in a public health emergency, but alongside that, the UK government is not the most transparently minded government. Yes, we have freedom of information laws. Of course, in a public health emergency, there's a lot of pressure on government to get things done quickly, to be seen to do it, as has been mentioned, is important. But I'm not being cynical, to have a positive public health benefit. There was limited consultation by government of stakeholders, including civil society groups, some of which I was involved in. How much the government actually took into account the feedback from those consultation with stakeholders, I'm not sure. I don't think either of them are in the room, but if you know Lillian Edwards or Michael Veal, they were both quite high profile in the media because they were doing a lot of work on these issues, and I think did a great public service by explaining to journalists and on big national TV news programs, what was going on, and explaining the difference between a centralized and decentralized model. So, I'm not sure what you'd call government by Lillian and Michael, but perhaps not the most democratic method of decision making, as much as I was sympathetic to what they were saying. The UK government spent quite a bit of time putting pressure, particularly on Apple, as did other governments to try to facilitate a more centralized model. If you remember at the time, effectively, Apple in particular made it very difficult for governments to go down this centralized route through, very particular niche tech issues to do with power saving and battery life, mainly because it was putting these apps, iOS in particular was putting these apps, these centralized apps, to sleep very frequently. And so then they weren't doing the contact tracing job that they were supposed to. And that in the end was actually what pushed the UK government to move to the decentralized model. It was that very pragmatic, practical issue. Apple would not make that change. People, including Michael and I and others, did make the obvious point to the UK, media and government, well, if the UK government really wants Apple to do this, it has a majority in Parliament, it could have rushed emergency legislation through Parliament to try to require Apple to do it. I would be very surprised if Apple would have withdrawn its products from the UK market entirely in response to that, but who knows? But that was never seriously debated, and I think, democracy, particularly when you're thinking about sensitive issues like public health data and location tracking by government, it shouldn't just be ministers making decisions, it should be members of parliament, it should be legislators, and that really didn't happen. The Parliament's Committee on Human Rights recommended the government pass a specific law in relation to the use of personal data, and the government said no. The GDPR is enough. The GDPR, for now, despite Brexit, still applies in the UK, and the UK government said that's enough. But of course, then that links very much to this theme of moving beyond privacy and to a slightly lesser extent bias. That's in the GDPR. The extent to which the UK government took note of the wider ethical issues. So two things it did. To start, being positive, it commissioned, so this NHSX organisation commissioned a rapid evidence review from the Ada Lovelace Institute, who several of them are here. You'll know them. Then that's not a privacy-focused organisation. That's looking at wider ethical issues relating to AI. This was very early on in the pandemic, so that their review was completed the 20th of April 2022, so that was about a month after the UK first imposed lockdown restrictions when the pandemic got serious enough. The conclusions were deep social risks of digital contact tracing outweighed the value offered to the crisis response, and extensive work would be required to overcome these issues. That didn't seem to be the feedback the UK government was looking for, so I'm not sure it had any impact. The NHSX did also set up an ethics board, so great, another tick from CPDP and people doing research in this area. It didn't last very long. I think it lasted 12 weeks, if I remember. It was quite critical. I'm sure that played a part of the role in it not lasting beyond the 12 weeks. They had some interesting and specific criticisms as well. In a final report, the Ethical Advisory Board, which Lillian Edwards was a member of, published, they said the speed of app development made it difficult to explore the ethical implications of the technical choices and tests that were being undertaken. The board was frustrated at the quality of information it was given, and did not always feel suitably comprehensive or final answers were supplied by the government to their questions. They further noted journalists had received briefings that seemed to be at variance with those being presented to the board. So the government was actually telling journalists sometimes different things to what they were telling their own ethics advisory board. So there we are. The 5 dependencies that the report identifies, so economic and infrastructural, ethical, political, civic, and regulatory. Reading the report, I was really struck actually from a completely different frame of the EU Digital Markets Act that I've spent a lot of the last 2 years looking at. I could see really clear links actually. So, this was a sort of very ethics-focused report, but from a much more economic perspective, I think there are things that can be done and actually are being done by the EU and a little bit more slowly the UK and many other governments. So a dependency of government on a small number of large tech infrastructure companies, competition law and regulation is one way to address that. That is exactly what the Digital Markets Act is doing. I mean, I even saw in your terms sector creep and scope creep. Competition economists would call them economies of scope and scale, and that's the starting point of government proposals to reform digital competition law. So I think as a response, looking forward, what can governments do to be in a better position next time? That's one important area, I would say. A second is governments need to become smarter and more ethically aware commissioners of public service technology. Clearly, many governments do not have the capability to build these kind of systems themselves, and I'm not sure they should try to acquire it, but they certainly, from a democratic perspective, should be commissioning it and understanding the ethical implications of what kinds of technology they commission and how it works. The UK government has a Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which played some role in this saga, but it's not quite clear where it's going now. Transparency, you would hope, would be a basic starting point in enabling civil society and other stakeholders to contribute to these kind of technologies, but in the UK, Foxglove had to sue the government to get them to release basic details and contracts and data protection impact assessments relating to some of the other COVID-related technology which Palantir was supplying to the UK government. So I think those are all, in some ways they should be uncontroversial good government and better competition measures governments can take to address these issues. But finally, it is something I've written about in other areas already, where you see these very powerful multinational companies playing such a critical role in basic public sector functions as health, public health, education, and so on. In general, human rights law applies to states. That's it, their obligations on states. There's been a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years on business and social responsibility, for example. How big companies can take note of human rights obligations, if not have them applied directly to them. I do think COVID tech, as well as other areas of tech I've looked at in the past, we're getting to the point where the democratic impact of the decisions of some of these very, very large multinational powerful corporations is getting to the point we should be thinking about more directly applying human rights obligations to them. That's a whole other conversation, but happy to have that amongst other questions people might have today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ian. We are, I think, about 20 minutes left for Q&A discussion. Before I predominate the Q&A, I'd like to ask if there are any questions from the audience for any of the panelists. I imagine there's a microphone that we can use. Okay. Any reactions, questions, provocations? No? Okay. Perhaps you'll warm up. Grace, I have a question for you. I hope you're still with us. And I think perhaps by extension it may also apply to you as well, Mariana. Both of your countries have recently sort of passed data protection laws, or now data protection authorities in place that have been tasked with enforcing the new laws. And I was just wondering, sort of for Kenya and Brazil respectively, has there been any sort of public activity or sort of enforcement actions related to the use of sort of data during the pandemic, questions of the sort of private sector's involvement in the pandemic response in Kenya and Brazil? I appreciate that civil society has been quite active in trying to raise awareness of some of these issues and forcing transparency where possible. But one of the roles that DPAs are supposed to play is being the sort of the police and the sort of watchdog for the public on these sorts of issues. So just curious, Grace, did the new Kenyan DPA do anything in this area?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I'd first like to start with a disclaimer that the law is really, really new because it was only passed in late 2019. Yep. So it's only been in place for maybe 2 years or something. And so they're actually at the point of registering data processors and controllers. But something interesting is that there's some level of awareness, at least that, among people who are digital natives or very tech savvy. So, for example, questions are already being raised about political uses of data, which is not necessarily a COVID-related directly related to COVID, but more related to elections. Questions are also being raised about MNOs or mobile network operators who want to gather so much more data. They say it's for purposes of, for example, preventing fraud, but people are taking or are trying to make use of the law as a tool and asking whether that's really necessary or whether there are no other ways to deal with this. In the academic community, there's already some what we'd call recognition that privacy is only one aspect of data and that we need to think about all other aspects of data, from competition, from non-personal data to data sharing, to creating economies where people in different African countries can share data. And so I know within other frameworks, for example, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, there's already this discussion on what to do with data so that that data can be meaningful for ourselves, as opposed to data protection, which creates a small market only for a few companies, and then everybody else is told that no, you cannot touch the data because it's against the data protection law.
Thanks, Grace. Mariana?
So to answer your question about the DPAs, the DPA particularly, and enforcement, the answer is no. Something interesting is that the Brazilian General Data Protection Law was passed in almost 4 years ago, but it entered into force in September of 2020, and the pandemic was actually used as a pretext to try to postpone the ability of the DPA to sanction. There was a difference, like the most of the law entered into force at one point, and then the sanctions part was later, and the pandemic was also kind of used as a reason for that to happen, because companies had other priorities and wouldn't be able to comply with the legislation. So the DPA has done a lot of work on regulating some of the aspects of the law and also providing guidance, but little in terms of actual enforcement still. So this is one point. But the second thing is that the pandemic there was an opportunity for other enforcement arenas, so particularly the judiciary. So there was no discussion or little discussion about the development and acquirement of technologies like this, the research that we are discussing, but there was a case, a very important case, where a public institute, statistics institute in Brazil required data from telecom companies to be able to continue their work, their research, and the provision of statistics. And this was brought to the Supreme Court in Brazil, and this was the case where the data protection as an autonomous fundamental right, separate from privacy, which was already in the Constitution, was recognized, and there was a lot of discussion for the first time by the Supreme Court of what data protection is, what data protection is in 2020, which was when this happened. So no, specifically about the technologies and what we're discussing, no, but there was this other case which was also in the context of the pandemic and was an opportunity for data protection constitutionalization in Brazil.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Peter, you have a question or just stretch?
Yeah, I thought standing near where my exists would be a signal.
It is a good signal. Well, maybe you have a sore back like me. And
No, well, I probably would have done that in back then. Peter Swire, I'm a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, Georgia. I had some observations about the U.S. Just because there's some perhaps surprising things living through COVID. So I have, I guess, 3 quick points. The first is the United States, as we all know, does not have a general privacy law. And so you might infer from that there would be a great deal of violations of privacy because the legal protection wasn't in place. And instead, roughly speaking, there was paralysis and very little collection of data for a whole variety of reasons. But there's not necessarily a straight causal thing from having a law to having limits on uses of data. So that's the first thing. And the public health people were extremely frustrated about that because they didn't get data that they thought some of their colleagues were getting in other countries. A second thing is that the U.S. lack of trust in government, which is, we have the Fourth Amendment and lots of other ways in our laws to show the lack of trust in government, meant that we completely failed in the United States to have any ability to prove whether we'd had COVID or not. There was no, I have 2 pieces of paper in my pocket that claim to assert that I had 2 shots and a booster, but it's trivial to fake that. Yep. And when I came to Brussels in November, I was unable to prove to the Belgians that I'd been vaccinated even though I had, and I had to take multiple tests day after day before I was allowed in restaurants because we had no ability to, as Americans, prove that we'd had COVID because there was no system to organize the data with any kind of credibility. So that's just a couple of observations having lived through it. And then Ian's suggestion that we expand CPDP to do human rights to all corporations.
Not all.
Only the big 5 or whatever your favorite list is that week. Having talked with Apple and Google some as they were working on their app, I think they were overwhelmed by the sense of risk if they came near personal data. That some enforcer somewhere in the 120 countries with privacy laws would be coming at them, and even if they got, your favorite 10 biggest regulators to sign off on it, they had no assurance somebody else wouldn't go after them and say they're a privacy disaster. And so what I heard from Ian partly was the frustrations of government officials being constrained by tech. And what I observed also was tech companies feel constrained from what they might have done if they could design it differently by the so many different legal systems coming at them that they did much less than probably they would have designed otherwise. And that, I think there were public health consequences and there were privacy enhancing technologies that could have done more with data, and they just couldn't go there because they didn't want to be the bad guys when COVID happened. So just some observations from U.S. experience.
No, I appreciate that as a U.S. citizen who still doesn't understand why there's not an app that Americans can use when they travel, or at least a reliable one. Bruno.
She's first.
Ah, okay. Sorry, Tamar.
I didn't recognize you in person. Hi, I'm Tamar Sharon, Professor of Philosophy and Digitalization at Radboud University in the Netherlands. I'm working on a lot of similar topics, this idea of sphere transgressions and big tech moving into new sectors, also from before the pandemic, especially I've been looking at healthcare. And I fully agree with, for many of the reasons that were mentioned on the panel, that privacy and data protection barely scratch the surface of what is at risk or at stake with these types of transgressions, and we need to be thinking much broader. I wanted to ask Ian, or everyone actually, so this is something I'm grappling with myself, if we do try to think broader and we're thinking about regulation, so the European Commission now has this whole collection of acts it's coming out with. Ian, you mentioned the Digital Services Act, right? Market, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not a policy or legal scholar. I always feel a bit nervous in this territory, but these are my thoughts. With the work that I'm doing in my group in Nijmegen on sphere transgressions, I think you can say that the 2 main risks that we're seeing that move beyond, of course, the privacy and surveillance type thing, is the creation of new dependencies on these actors for the provision of public goods, and that's been mentioned. There's another one that's a very big one, and well, to say, I think the Digital Markets Act, in the way that you mentioned, Ian, might be able to address those dependencies. There's another big risk, and that is how these actors start reshaping sectors in line not only with their own financial interests, but with their own value sets and norms and principles. So what we saw with the digital contact tracing case was also maybe a new digital infrastructure being built that we will be dependent on in the future, but also a clash of expertise. So indeed, the epidemiologists were in favor of centralized contact tracing for very good reasons that have to do with the type of thing they do when they're trying to track a pandemic and clusters of infections and the like. And Google and Apple came along and said, no, we're taking the privacy side, or there are tech limitations, so we go for decentralization. So in that clash of domain expertise, epidemiologists versus Google and Apple won out. So it wasn't just a dependency, it was in that sense a clash of domain expertise in a new domain where the companies are gaining influence, which is not proportional to them having this traditional or original expertise. And there are many examples of this. So if we look at healthcare, I mean, one of the things we're looking at is Apple's Research Kit app, which is software for doing clinical studies on iPhones. It's not a privacy issue because there's no data that goes to Apple. It's not a data protection issue. There is an issue of, will this mean that remote clinical trials, which seem to be very promising for how we'll be doing biomedical research in the future, be done on iPhones the way that Apple has defined. So that is a kind of new influence on the sector, a reshaping of how something like biomedical research is being done. The DMA or the DSA or any of the other acts that I see coming out, I do not think address this. So we might be saying these companies, you know, it's not just a procurement issue of if we need to use digital technologies and they're being developed by private actors, we need to lay down better conditions as to, you know, what we get out of collaborating with them. There's another danger that these companies moving in start, again, reshaping those sectors in line with a whole other set of values and norms and principles, which are not the ones of the sphere or the sector itself. And then you get a change there also of the aim of the sector, because these values and norms have been used to reach certain aims. So I'd like to hear what, you know, which act can we look towards for this kind of thing? Where does salvation lie if it's not in also reducing these sectors to new markets? Because that's what something like the Digital Markets Act would do. This is not just about regulating the digital economy. Public health is not a market. Education is not a market. So yeah, that's my question, and it's really an open one. It's not a critical one towards you, but I'm really trying to grapple with this myself.
I don't have an answer, sadly, to which act sort of solves our problem. I mean, I have another example of the problem you're describing. Palantir is my favorite sort of bogeyman in this space, and they're increasingly active in the humanitarian sector, where I fear they're also reshaping how humanitarian organizations understand crisis and what's an effective response to crisis. We'll talk about this next month at the workshop, I hope, in a bit more depth. But no, I certainly appreciate that it's not just about dependencies, although those are really important. It's about sort of reshaping sort of what a sector does and how it sort of defines itself, for sure. Ian might have something to say on the sort of policy front, please.
I think it's going to be an ever bigger issue going in the future, just for the really simple reason, the huge economies of scale that these companies, you know, if they're building similar systems, which they can sell in 195 countries rather than just in 1 or 2 countries, that's going to create enormous pressure in that direction that you're describing of you know, it's huge. It's a huge advantage to companies of the scale of Apple and so on, and they can invest. You know, they have these incredibly turbocharged shares. You know, Apple, I think, is still over $2 trillion. I haven't sort of followed it day by day. I don't own any of their shares, but you know, that gives them an incredible ability to invest in new technologies and sectors, as well as to make use of existing infrastructure and systems they have, not least, as you mentioned, with the health research, phones in X billion people's pockets around the world, which can be incredibly powerful. It links back to something Peter said as well, which I think is interesting. I should have made clear when I was talking about constitutionalism and perhaps from the start, a lot of privacy activists in the UK were very in favour of the move that happened. And in one sense, I think you can see the way that Google and Apple's decisions constrained the capability of the UK government to make a different decision about models as quasi-constitutional. You know, it was a significant constraint on the UK government's power to take that more interventionist, if you like, approach. And in one sense, Peter, I say this as a positive thing, not as a criticism of the US. You could say that is quite a US constitutional position, is it not? You know, compared to many other countries, the US Constitution is seen very strongly as a set of negative constraints on how the federal government operates. And in one sense, that's what Google and Apple's decision did to many governments. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just observing, in a sense, it already did, Tamar, what you're talking about. It slightly imposed this US view of negative rights on many other governments around the world. For people who are very privacy-focused or liberty-focused, which I would personally count myself as, I can see some arguments in favor of that. It's not democratic in the sense of allowing, the voters of the UK, to whom the UK government is accountable, to have their wishes respected. And I think that will be an enormously challenging problem in future. To answer your sort of policy, soup question, I think there are sort of two complementary approaches governments can take, and the EU and others are taking. One is the DMA type approach, the Digital Markets Act approach, which is to try to say effectively, let's make sure hopefully in the long term, governments don't face this dilemma anymore of having these multinational tech firms that are more powerful than them, that you actually, in effect, over time, reshape the market so there are many more smaller players which will give, a range of different options to governments in procuring the kind of technologies that we're talking about, but B, the very simple, political constraint on the power of the companies, if they're much smaller, to take decisions against the interests of particularly large governments. Alongside that, I think, recognizing reality that there are these very powerful companies, then, okay, does that mean governments have to move to more direct regulation of the behavior of those companies? And in a sense, that's what the Digital Services Act does in relation to online markets, not relating to the kind of markets and quasi-markets we're talking about today. I think we'll need both of those approaches, and doing it in health, in education, in humanitarian sector is going to be a lot of work and politically very challenging.
Yep.
And if I may add, not all governments are democratic governments.
Indeed.
What we need is more democratic oversight over powerful technology companies. I also think we need to reduce their overall power. But it becomes incredibly complicated when you're dealing in contexts where there is no rule of law, where regulation is not really an option. And I think this is where I think it's been characterized as a clash of domain expertise. The contact tracing apps, I would characterize it differently. It was settled on the smallest common denominator, almost. So the decision that was, I would say, good for privacy also meant that democratic governments could not use technology in a crisis in the way that they wanted, which is also problematic.
Thank you, Frederic. I've been told that we're out of time, but I'm going to let Bruno ask this question because he's been very patient. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm Bruno Bioni, Executive Director of Data Privacy Brazil, so I'm colleague of Mariana. I'd like to hear more about this argument that the existing laws are not enough to deal with this problem about data justice, or whatever the term that we'd like to use. Because if you take in consideration not only data protection laws, but public administration law, constitutional values, health laws, and I think it's a question of articulating properly those laws and making more cases. Yeah. So it's a question, okay, we can build up another regulatory layers, DMA, DSA, but in terms of allocating efficiently our resources that are limited. Yeah. And this is, I'm trying to build a dialogue with the excellent report that you came out.
Thank you.
It's a question to do a case. So for instance, just to give two examples, the digital ID case in Kenya. It's about using properly data protection law to take down a public policy that is completely wrong in terms of risk benefits. The case that we did in Brazil, it was just using data protection law. So in that direction, you should put more energy trying to build another regulation layers, or using the existing laws to achieve data justice?
It's a great question. We should probably discuss it over a drink because people are, but just very briefly, I think we could do more with the laws that we have, in particular data protection. I don't mean to throw it out the window, and this is a conversation we have with Lynette all the time. Let's not completely sort of poo-poo data protection. But I think it speaks to Tamar's points around, these are ethical problems, not so much legal problems. And so the perfect law can't address some of these ethical dilemmas around, for example, dependencies and sort of reshaping what entire spheres and sectors are about and their priorities and so forth. So that's a sort of cheap answer. We can discuss more in a beer, over a beer. Cool. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the great attendance at such a late hour. Thank you, Grace and Frederic, as well. Hope to see you both soon. Bye-bye.